Parasite Eve first launched in Japan in March of 1998, and in North America in September of the same year. Made by Squaresoft and produced by Hironobu Sakaguchi of Final Fantasy fame, this 2-disc action RPG was, and still is, a very unique kind of game. I personally consider Parasite Eve a must-play Christmas game. For those who have played it, you might understand when I refer to this as Die Hard, the survival horror JRPG. Yes, you heard that right. If you haven't played this game before, you'll understand this statement by the end. The game starts on Christmas Eve. Although you can change your character's first name, her canon name is Aya Brea. NYPD newbie Aya Brea is on a blind date with the world's biggest beta male, attending an opera with great seats provided by her date's wealthy father. Shortly after you take your seats, the play begins and we get one of our first, and what I still consider one of the most memorable FMV sequences on the PlayStation 1, and definitely one of the coolest in the game. Eve, the star of the opera, begins singing, and immediately you can tell this game is showing its age, with her elasticy mouth gaping open in the strangest elliptical formations. The voiceovers for her vocals are all built-in synthesizers and create a very unnatural sound. A sound you'll be hearing quite a few times throughout the game, but one I find rather characteristic and charmingly outdated. Eve and Aya share a quick, knowing glance when suddenly the male lead of the opera bursts into flames. Assuming this is pyrotechnics and special effects, much of the audience sits and looks on in wonder, until the flames spread to them. Still convinced it's special effects, the audience takes a while to react, and they all spontaneously combust. At least, the game says they all do. Aya is talked about several times as being the only survivor, but we clearly see in the cutscene right after this that her beta male date lived just long enough to be knocked out by Aya, who simply had enough of his beta male bullshit. Aya may be a rookie cop, but she's a serious woman with no patience for petty shit. When I played this game as a kid, this scene blew me away, and still to this day I think it's badass. The way the music counterpoints the violence on screen is a solid IRL pelvic thrust and drag, balls to the wall introduction to a video game. Following this, Aya pursues Eve underground where she begins to have visions of a young kid in a hospital gown. Her next few encounters with Eve, she is told that she is special, and that her mitochondria is on the verge of an evolutionary breakthrough. But why Aya? What makes her so special, and how was she immune to the combustion everybody else in the opera house experienced simply by being in close proximity to Eve? Who is Eve besides a low-poly monster girl? All these questions and more are tackled over the 8-hour runtime of the game as you battle hideous mutated animals, reanimated dinosaurs that completely break suspension of disbelief, and continue your investigatory work as an NYPD rookie on Christmas and the surrounding days, even after events get so bad that the city is completely evacuated. As far as JRPGs go, having a New York cop on Christmas battle horror-inspired creatures turned monster through mutagenic means is already a very unique premise. But what truly sets Parasite Eve apart is its combat. You see, Squaresoft were big dogs at the time, and they wanted to flaunt that. From the now terribly outdated look of the rotating 3D world map of New York, to the FMVs that show how much difference it makes when you don't sculpt the more nuanced features of the human face, to the back of the game case that boasts, battle mutant monsters in real-time polygonal combat. It's really hard to believe that at one point, polygonal was a buzzword used to sell video games to people, but certainly the proof is right here in the pudding. Squaresoft wanted people to know they had the biggest dicks on the PlayStation, and they were intent on finding ways to consensually wave it in your face at every opportunity. This of course led to the real-time polygonal combat found here in Parasite Eve. Battles don't quite happen randomly, but there are no particular way to avoid them. Simply walking onto a screen will trigger the battle that's set to happen there. Although if you have done this battle once already, they seem to have a lower chance of actually triggering upon returning. Enemies spawn when battle starts, and battles take place in the actual environment, rather than a separate stage like most RPGs were doing at the time. During battle, you move around at your heart's content just as the enemies do, but you cannot perform actions until your AT meter up here is full. The AT meter is little more than a timer. Think of it as similar to Final Fantasy VI or Chrono Trigger. Once your AT is charged, there's a number of things you can do. Pushing triangle will open a menu where you can use items, change equipped gear, or use PE. PE is kind of like mana in this game. As you progress, you will learn new abilities that require PE. From the different levels of healing and curing, to haste, to special energy attacks, the game gives you a lot to work with, but if you use all of your PE, you will be temporarily stunned. Of course, when your AT is filled, you can also attack. Although you do have a club for melee attacks, your primary weapon will be a gun. Guns have their own stat systems and special abilities, and can be modified using tools to be made even stronger. When you choose to attack, a green polygonal grid will appear around you. This shows the range of your weapon. Hitting an enemy outside of this grid will have a high chance of missing or will severely reduce your damage. Depending on your weapon, you can fire a different amount of times. You can pump all of your shots into one enemy or mix and match them as you see fit. It's worth noting here that ammo is limited in this game, but that limit is not very low. By the time I completed the game, I had hundreds more bullets than I needed, although some guns, such as rocket launchers, will take its own unique type of ammo that are far more difficult to keep stocked. Aya can also equip armor and bulletproof vests to up her defense. Unfortunately, these do not appear on her character model. Strangely enough, neither does the gun you equip, at least not outside of battle. Although it appears she has a full set of animations with every weapon in her hand, as soon as you leave battle, her character model defaults back to the basic police issue pistol. This of course doesn't bother me at all, but it's a strange detail to note. Perhaps only half as strange as her body being 70% legs, but strange nonetheless. As you battle, you gain XP to level up with. On top of this, you are also rewarded BP. BP stands for bonus points and can be used to up the defense efficacy of your armor, the damage output of your pistol, reduce the time it takes to charge your AT meter, or boost your inventory space. Much like other survival horror games of the time, the inventory space is really hurting. With just the keys and passes you need for the stages alone, you'll find you're overburdening your character and needing to throw away perfectly good weapons and curatives to keep picking up new keys to progress. Again, this is a minor annoyance and one you can work around by boosting your inventory space limit. But using your bonus points on AT or upping the damage of a gun to make it OP seems like a much better way to use your bonus points to me. This is a battle system I really enjoy in concept and even in execution, but one thing hampers the experience down terribly throughout the game. It's just too damn easy. Being able to move freely feels great, but the enemies seem to move too slowly and too predictably. The enemy attacks are clearly telegraphed, but to an extent that it's almost difficult to get hit by them. This means combat boils down to dodging until your AT is full, firing a couple shots, and repeating ad nauseum, usually coming out of battle with hardly a scratch. This is true straight up until the final stages of the game. It's not a fault of the battle system though, it's a fault of the enemies they populated the main campaign with. Anybody who's played through the Chrysler Building in the post-game content will tell you just how hard battle can actually be. All things considered, perhaps this doesn't deserve the survival horror credit I gave it earlier, as surviving is made fairly easy due to an overabundance of ammo and easy enemies. Item management is rough, sure, but that's not quite enough to earn the credit, so we'll stick to just calling this a horror from now on. Throughout the game, Parasite Eve builds a small yet strong supporting cast of characters. From the over-assertive and condescending scientist known as Hans Clamp, who if we follow die-hard logic you know is automatically the bad guy, to Kunihiko Maeda, a young Japanese scientist residing in America for studies, to the hardened veteran detective Daniel Bodalis and his son Ben Dallas, as well as a few more. Much to my surprise and pleasure, playing this game through as an adult, I realized just how mature and grounded many of these characters were, and how much development they actually undergo in the short runtime of the game. Detective Dallas, for instance, has a very heavy subplot involving his home life, his marital problems, and his everyday issues that stem from being a responsible and loving father while working his detective position. The Japanese scientist Maeda only appears halfway through the game, but he too shows a fair deal of character development. An easy example of this can be seen early game in his steadfast belief that nothing is to be believed without adequate evidence. As the game progresses, Maeda will begin filling your inventory with cultural good luck charms, and even concede by the end that, even though something has yet to be proven scientifically, there can be a purpose and comfort in having belief in it. As a game, I do believe most of it still holds up, both visually thanks mostly to its great pre-rendered backgrounds, and mechanically. It definitely shows its age in the sound design and even in the FMVs to some regard, but even these have a bit of a campy charm. While I do think the faces are a bit uncanny valley, the scenes depicting transformations are still quite stunning. I do have 3 complaints I do absolutely wish were handled differently, however. The first being the battle music. There is a lot of great themes in this game, and I do generally enjoy the music, but I'm not so sure the battle music is one of the great themes. This track feels average at best to me, and used in entirely the wrong kind of place. This theme seems more fitting to menu music than anything action-oriented, and it's used more than any other track in the game. But even I can concede that perhaps this odd choice just lends to the strange yet alluring tonality of the Parasite Eve universe. The second complaint is the lack of D-pad support. The D-pad does absolutely nothing in this game, and I personally hate navigating menus with analog sticks, but analog sticks were the new hot thing at the time, so of course they would force the focus onto them. And my third and final big complaint is in the end chapter of the game. The final chapter is 4 boss battles in a row and a chase sequence. The bosses themselves aren't a problem because, as I stated before, the game is absurdly easy. Fun, but absurdly easy. However, once these bosses are defeated, you must escape the ship the final battle took place on. If you are so much as touched by the enemy who's pursuing you, it's game over. There is nowhere to save after the boss battles are over, so once you hit game over, it's back to the start of the chapter. What makes this bad to me is that you have to escape through an area you've never seen before. Some directions lead to dead ends, which means going down them is inevitably a game over. Discovering which one is a dead end is no more than trial and error and comes off as cheap artificial difficulty. Given the game is also played on fixed camera angles, oftentimes moving from one screen to another will reverse your perspective, and you could end up walking right back the way you came when the new screen loads, landing you in yet another game over. Every time you get game over, it means dealing with unskippable cutscenes, and it's all just more annoying than necessary. But this is just a single black mark in an otherwise great but easy horror JRPG. Parasite Eve, as I see it, is that game most commonly referred to as, oh yeah, that game, I remember that game, that was a good game, they should make more games like that. It's a game that left a lasting memory in most of us who played it due to its unique set pieces like the opera house in the intro, or the boss battle aboard a chariot being pulled through New York by 2 flaming horses. Despite that, and despite it being based on a well-received novel, despite it being released at the height of Japanese horror in cinema, and despite it landing 2 more games in its series, it never managed to make much of a cultural impact. If you want a Christmas game to play that's a little off the beaten path, or you just want something unique that bears the telltale signs of being a product of its time, this short cinematic romp I refer to as Die Hard, the horror JRPG, might be just what you're looking for. While I personally would have liked more of a challenge from the main campaign, I think this was a great game and a great first attempt at something like this, and a wonderfully unique experience that should be felt and not forgotten. Parasite Eve II released on December 16th of 1999 in Japan. Roughly 9 months later, it released in Europe and North America. Developed and published by Squaresoft, this is the second entry in the series of the same name. Although it received mostly positive reviews at launch, negative reviews weren't exactly uncommon, and to this day, this remains a very divisive game. Some people claim this to be their favorite in the series, and at times, their favorite in the PS1 library. This sentiment is far more common for European audiences, however, this opinion doesn't have as much value as it seems, because Parasite Eve I never released in PAL territories. If you've seen the video I done for Parasite Eve I, you know that the game was incredibly unique in almost every regard. It tried something new and it was commended for it very highly. For better or worse, Parasite Eve II abandoned the gameplay mechanics that made PE1 unique almost entirely, and opted for something more along the lines of Silent Hill or Resident Evil 1 and 2. Whether this was a good direction to take the series in is up to the individual to decide, but it would serve us best to not make comparisons to Parasite Eve I's gameplay and to just judge this on its own merits. The game starts and we reprise our role as Aya Brea. Aya is no longer the New York cop she was in the previous game, as this one is set after the events of the first. Aya now belongs to an organization called MIST. MIST is the Mitochondrial Investigation and Suppression Team. Aya's job is to respond to and investigate the occurrences of NMCs. An NMC is a neo-mitochondrial creature. In short, these are creatures who have been transformed into violent and hideous monsters by an evolutionary process taking place in the mitochondria of their cells. Aya shares similarities to these creatures in the sense that her mitochondria have also undergone a change, but hers doesn't result in a transformation of her image. Instead, Aya has extra defenses against the power of NMCs and can access the untapped potential of the mitochondria that live in our cells. While it's not necessary to play the first game to understand this one, I would recommend it just to get the full backstory of where Aya's powers come from. But otherwise, you can jump into this one completely blind and experience it for what it is on its own. This is mostly made possible because the game uses an almost entirely new cast of characters, with characters from the previous game rarely getting little more than a passing reference to create loose ties between the two entries. The new cast of characters sadly lack any semblance of depth, but they serve as a decent enough tool to progress the plot. A plot that can be replayed several times over thanks to the multiple endings intrinsically tied to the different character routes. The game starts with an event at the Acropolis Tower. A SWAT team has already arrived and the situation looks grim, so Mist is called in to respond. Before we enter the tower, we are greeted by something so visually impressive it truly feels ahead of its time. While the pre-rendered backgrounds of the game are absolutely amazing in their own right, this is on a whole other level. It feels as though you are watching one of the game's FMVs, but control is still in your hands. The aspect ratio for this segment, much like with the FMVs, had to be dwarfed so the hardware could support it, but it is just incredible seeing that this level of visual fidelity could be supported during gameplay without relying on static backgrounds. After a brief talk with the squad on the ground level, Aya rides the elevator up to the top of Acropolis Tower and we're assaulted with the image of a gruesome massacre. This does great to strike a tone for the beginning of the game. The visuals and ambience here create an almost oppressive and eerie atmosphere. The next little bit sees us wandering around the tower for any trace of where these NMCs may have come from. What Aya finds is a human NMC, and a skyscraping boss battle ensues. The boss battle is very much puzzle-oriented and serves as a great example of what's to come later. The boss escapes, and Aya, with her partner Rupert, is evacuated via helicopter as the building explodes. With the clues she gathered at the Acropolis Tower, the next step in her investigation takes her to Dryfield, a mostly abandoned desert town with possibly the worst layout a town could have. Really, Dryfield is just a glorified truck stop, but there's a lot going on here. Dryfield is small but complicated to get around, so it will feel much bigger than it actually is. The type of exploration that begins here will be how the rest of the game plays out. You will be going through each building, hall, and yard several times over, backtracking and solving puzzles and riddles as certain areas get blocked off and new areas open up. Much akin to how the first mansion works in Resident Evil, only not quite as sensibly designed. From here on out, the story is quite a bit slower to unfold. Aya continues to investigate the source of the NMCs and the ANMCs, the artificial neo-mitochondrial creatures, gathering clues and following them to their next logical location. The mystery deepens and develops beyond the ANMCs, uncovering a suspicious science facility and simultaneously raising questions about Aya's past. The story themes in most regards are horror-based, as this is through and through a survival horror game, but some of it feels so hokey and off the wall it's hard to take it seriously. Parasite Eve I definitely had a story that took itself too seriously as well, but it was easier to be engaged with it because that game didn't have unprompted boss battles against mutated elephants with guns for mouths. As cool as this design is visually, I just couldn't help but wonder who made it and why. Like attaching airplane wings to a giraffe, it's laughable at best, and the answers don't exactly offer a good enough excuse. For as serious as the game tries to be with its atmosphere and mechanics, it'd serve it well to not have bosses with such exaggerated and comical designs. Perhaps just as bad were the golems later in the game, whose goofy appearance gives off a vibe similar to the augurs in Night Trap.
Very well.
Some enemies were legitimately creepy, however, if only because of these faces. With all this in mind, Parasite Eve II's story and presentation began to feel a lot more like a B-grade horror to me. Like Army of Darkness, mixed heavily with the themes of Metal Gear Solid, Resident Evil, and a casual dash of visual inspiration from The Matrix. It's not necessarily a bad thing, as I do really enjoy B-grade horror, but it's simply too obvious how serious it's actually supposed to be, and so the tone consistently conflicts with the imagery and themes. Design hilarity aside, the boss battle against the gun-mouthed zombie elephant was pretty rad, and highlights the game's unique attention to detail as the boss destroys the environment in real time as you fight him. If there's one thing Parasite Eve II gets right unquestionably, it's the visuals. Characters all have clear and expressive faces. The environments with their pre-rendered backgrounds look incredible, and the way firing your gun changes the lighting on your character shows how much attention to detail actually went into the game, especially for the year it came out. The FMV sequences as well, while not usually thematically grand, are a major improvement over the first in terms of fidelity and realism. While I loved the FMVs in the first game, people thought I was too hard on them because I pointed out just how dated they became. People stated that FMVs like that are to be expected and don't need to be pointed out. For the most part, I agree they are to be expected, but this game is proof of just how much better they could do on the same hardware around roughly the same time. Parasite Eve II released not even 2 years after the first, and the difference in the FMVs feels generations apart. In many ways, I feel the FMVs here could be on the PS2 and nobody would question it. The one and only visual complaint I have is in the dialogue boxes. Simply put, they're ugly as sin. Thankfully, they are the only part of this game's interface I feel this way about. So we talked a lot about the visuals, the setup, and how the adventure actually unfolds, but I haven't hit on the combat and controls yet. I mentioned earlier the game works a lot more like Resident Evil or Silent Hill, but I didn't really tell you what any of that actually meant, so let's jump straight into that. New to this game are tank controls. These are not optional, so don't try to turn them off. I've long been a defender of tank controls, and especially in games with fixed camera angles like this. Battles all happen in real time, and the enemies exist in the stage before you engage, so random battles are done away with entirely. There are no timers or turn orders to control when or how you proceed during battle. When you aggro an enemy, the battle music simply ramps up and the dance routine begins. One nice feature here is that the game has 3 different battle tracks, and you choose for yourself which track to play in the options menu. If you are getting tired of one, you can switch it up at your convenience. The music in the game doesn't quite hit the heights of the first, but it's definitely all fine enough. Pushing square on the controller will target your enemy. While targeted, Aya will automatically orient herself to aim at the enemy. While aiming, simply press R1 or R2 to shoot, depending on your gun's firing capabilities. Bullets in the game are limited, but basic bullet types can be refilled to max at ammunition cases found throughout the stages. It is possible to run out, but the event is rare. Guns do not have the upgrade system they used to. Instead, this time you can equip accessories to them for stat boosts and additional features such as melee attack capabilities. This really helps control the balance of the game, as making a truly OP weapon early on is nearly impossible. The accessories for the guns can be found, but will most likely be purchased using BP, which is awarded at the end of each battle. BP will be your in-game currency and can be used to purchase curatives, ammo, and armor as well. The only armor in the game is bulletproof vests. Each vest has different stats and a different amount of item slots. The amount of item slots can be increased using items found during gameplay. The items you put in your vest slots are the only items you can bring into battle. Common items to put here are ammo, curatives, guns, and melee weapons. If you run out of ammo during battle and there's none left in your vest, well, sucks to be you. There is no way to change equipment once battle has begun. Some bosses can and will use every bullet you can bring into battle, and it can get very frustrating not having any way to change gear while in battle, but there's always a way to win if you try hard enough to find it. At the end of each battle, you are rewarded experience points. These don't go to leveling you up exactly, but they can be used to unlock and strengthen your special attacks that utilize this energy meter up here. When enemies attack you, your only real option aside from just taking the blow is evasion. So, this is where we run into what's arguably the biggest problem with the game, and it plagues the game from beginning to end. The combat is very action-heavy and will frequently have you fighting large amounts of enemies in environments that span several camera angles. The enemy placement in Parasite Eve II is absolutely atrocious, as many battles will begin with enemies you can't see from your camera angle and therefore cannot react to. Many enemies will telegraph an attack with a sound, but not all will, and when you have several enemies off camera, you have no way of knowing which of these dots on your GPS is coming after you. As such, your ability to evade an attack is a nearly useless ability to run blindly and hope for the best. This makes many battles boil down to shooting shit off camera that you don't know what it is, while hoping they don't find a way to rush you, and quite frankly, it just isn't fun. Without a pre-existing intimate knowledge of this game, this is going to be an extremely frustrating design flaw to play around. Not to make comparisons to Parasite Eve 1, but to use it as an example, Parasite Eve 1 made me appreciate something that game, and many others, do right that I've always taken for granted. In Parasite Eve 1, when a battle starts, the game takes over control of your character and camera, and brings you further into a zone. Once you're placed where the game wants you, the enemies spawn and battles happen on a single camera angle. This is done so you can see the whole battle as it's going on. This is useful, if not imperative, in real-time combat, especially if said combat is dealing with fixed camera angles and requires fast reflexes for proper evasion. Somewhere along the way, it seems Parasite Eve II missed the memo on that one, and this is without a doubt an egregious design flaw that just sucks the fun out of many battles and makes many more just feel like a frustrating and infuriating nuisance. Due to how the auto-aim works, if you are to competently evade, you'll need to jump between targeting on and off, otherwise Aya will always course correct to run straight at the enemy you are trying to avoid. This in and of itself wouldn't be too terrible if many of the battles weren't against hordes that just rush and surround you, leaving you no time to attack and evade, let alone balance whether or not you get to aim. It definitely makes the game harder, which addresses one of my biggest complaints about Parasite Eve 1, but it does so at the cost of decent mechanics, competent enemy placement, and good design. While the tank controls complement the fixed camera angles and pre-rendered backgrounds, the enemy placement and battle mechanics are incongruous at best. The game takes about 8 hours to complete on the best route, and even longer if you struggle with some of the puzzles along the way. With deaths, this will take about 10 hours to complete, 3.5 hours on disc 1, maybe another 5 on disc 2. Parasite Eve II at its best is a gritty survival horror with next generation cinematics, decent music, great visuals, and oppressive and eerie atmospheres, complemented by an equally eerie soundtrack and some cool enemy design and set pieces. At its worst, it's a disjointed B-grade horror with a tonal identity crisis, infuriating and debilitating design flaws, a control scheme incongruent with the battle mechanics, enemy placements incongruent to the level design, and a narrative incongruent with the tone. As a whole package, Parasite Eve II is simply okay at best. I like the idea of this becoming a proper survival horror with its inventory space, tank controls, and very unforgiving save points in the latter half. And I think each mechanic in the game on its own is just great. I am a fan of this game's individual pieces. But when everything is together in one package, I feel like it just falls apart. I feel almost certain I'll think back on this game fondly a year from now, as many people do, simply because of its unique set pieces, events, and atmosphere, but playing the game again is not something I see myself doing. And if I ever tried, I know I would give up quickly, as I remember just how much of its individual components do not work well with each other. If you feel I'm being unfair or disingenuous, then I dare you to gamble your nostalgia and boot this game up and see how genuine my criticisms really are. Without a pre-existing intimate knowledge of this game to play around its flaws with, it's hard to get much more than an okay at best experience out of. It might be an unpopular opinion, but it's the only one I got. As a full package, Parasite Eve II is okay at best. Parasite Eve II may be better remembered rather than replayed or revisited. With the release of Parasite Eve II, Square had cemented the title as an ongoing franchise. Although the fanbase was splintered due to massive changes in gameplay between entries, everybody was looking forward to a third installment, so they might get some type of concrete resolution for the characters they've come to know and love. The wait would be a long one, and the characters wouldn't exactly be what they remembered, but that resolution would eventually come. On December 22nd, 2010, nearly 11 years to the day they released Parasite Eve II, the third birthday released in Japan, later coming out in North America and the EU in March and April of 2011 respectively. Although it was initially announced the game would release episodically on mobile phones, that idea was scrapped quickly. Instead, they developed the game for the PS3 and then scaled it down, packaged it as a single piece of software, and sold it on physical UMD for the Sony PSP. Much like Parasite Eve II before it, the third birthday splintered the audience even further, as it deviated into yet another totally new direction for the series. Because of its radical change in gameplay and the fact that the game no longer bears the title of Parasite Eve, many people strike this game from the canon and insist that it is little more than a spin-off made for cheap entertainment. This is not the case. Similar to how Monster Hunter V was renamed to Monster Hunter World so that new players would not feel a barrier to entry, so too was Parasite Eve renamed to The Third Birthday. The idea in its development was to utilize new game technology and mechanics to bring Aya Brea to a new audience while at the same time build a proper continuation for her character for returning fans. As such, this game is its own standalone entry, as well as the canonical end to the series. So how well did they introduce Aya Brea to a new world of gamers in the new modern world of video games? Now, before we go any further, just to note, all the footage you're going to see was recorded with an emulator. I do own the game and I do own a PSP to properly play the game, but I'd have no way of capturing the footage this way. Using a PS3 controller, I mapped the button inputs to exactly what you would get on a PSP, so I could have as genuine an experience as I possibly could. So with no further ado, let's get into the story. If you're a returning fan to the series, you're probably not expecting a story about time travel. But a time travel story is exactly what we got. At the start of the game, we get a look at the future, New York 2012. Remember, this game came out in 2010 initially, so 2012 is the future. Everything seems relatively normal until this massive tentacle-looking lifeform erupts from the ground, throwing about cars and buildings like a toddler playing with toys. This tentacle formation is known as a Babel. From the Babel spawns many alien life forms known as the Twisted. Fast forward another year and a new organization called the Counter-Twisted Investigation, or CTI for short, has formed. One of the key members of this organization, its star agent, is none other than Aya Brea. However, Aya isn't anything like how you may remember her. Aya is no longer the tough, independent woman she was in the older games. Here, although she can still kick major ass, she has been reduced to an emotionally weak shell of a person who seems to greatly lack any depth of character beyond her ability to cry and get her ass in the camera's focus with seemingly no effort at all. Initially, the change in her personality is explained by amnesia she suffered following a tragic event 3 years prior, but we'll hear more on that later. Following her amnesia, Aya discovers she can transfer her soul between bodies and beyond space and time. This ability is called Overdive. Overdive is what makes her such a valuable commodity for CTI, and the only reason CTI can even operate. For the remainder of the game, Aya follows Revolver Ocelot's orders and jumps back through time to different periods in an attempt to prevent the Babel from ever occurring. As this is going on, the threads of time are unwoven and rewritten, as Aya receives flashbacks to the tragedy that caused her amnesia 3 years before. The more you uncover about the source of the Babel and the creatures it created, the more the story becomes needlessly convoluted. The tone never ceases taking itself entirely too seriously, and with every twist and turn the plot takes, it just becomes more and more difficult to continue caring about the why of it all. With the story so convoluted, some additional backstory is almost a necessity, but the amount of backstory that would be required to make the story feel smooth is so immense that the pace of the game would suffer drastically to include it all. And so the compromise here is that the backstory exists in-game text documents. Now, if you want a smooth story, you have to make the choice to read the extra documents yourself. And if you feel that reading these documents slows the game down too much, well, that's your fault because you're the one who made the choice to read it. Really, not much can be said about the story beyond this, as the story fails to make much sense until you reach the climax, and I'd like to hold off on spoilers until at least the end. In short, giant monsters are taking over Earth, and an amnesiac Aya Brea must travel back in time to prevent it. Brushing that out of the way, let's talk about the gameplay, this game's biggest deviation from its previous 2 entries. The third birthday is just like Parasite Eve II in one sense and one sense only. Both games looked to popular games of the time to model their mechanics after. Around 2010, first and third person shooters were in, and one of the latest and most influential advancements in the genre came from Gears of War. So what does this mean for the third birthday? Well, it means you get to experience taking cover behind chest-high walls on a 4.3-inch screen. In many ways, Third Birthday is a generic third-person shooter for its time, and in many ways, it's not. Aya can bring 3 guns into battle, and her loadout is up to you. You can buy numerous different types of guns between missions and at checkpoints, and also pay to add upgrades onto them. To switch guns, simply hold square and press the corresponding direction on your D-pad. Because of the PSP's limitations, you'll find a lot of work went into putting all the necessary mechanics for a third-person shooter into far less buttons. As a result, many buttons serve multiple purposes. Tapping square reloads your gun. Using the D-pad while not holding square is how you move your camera. Control-wise, this may be the biggest problem. While the camera has a bit of automatic control, it's not quite good enough to do all that you need. All character movement is done with the analog stick, so using the D-pad that's right above it on the same side of the PSP to control camera movement is cumbersome at best. This basically makes controlling your camera and character at the same time nearly impossible, and in a third-person shooter, good tight control is a necessity. With a degree of fumbling, you can get it, but it hardly feels ideal. You can fire with R and aim down sights with L. Circle throws grenade and X is more or less a general action button. While aiming at an enemy, if you idle long enough without shooting, something called a linkage meter will appear. This meter indicates your allies are taking aim at the same target you are. When the meter is charged, give the order and you all open fire for massive damage. When enough damage is inflicted fast enough, you'll see this triangle appear on your target. This is how Aya's overdive ability plays into battle, and how Third Birthday separates itself from other generic third-person shooters of the time. When this symbol appears, hit triangle. This will cause Aya to dive into the enemy and do massive damage from within. To traverse to different areas of a stage quickly, or simply to replenish some health or get a new weapon in your 4th weapon slot, you can also dive into your allies and adopt their stats and loadout. You will not take on their image, but everything that was once theirs now becomes yours. This adds a lot to combat and kind of inadvertently makes Aya a bit of a bad guy if we throw aside ludonarrative dissonance. To win in some of these battles, you'll need to be willing to dive into your allies and just allow them to get killed. To prevent the babble, Aya is going to leave a trail of innocent dead bodies in her wake, and just disregard their corpses like the ragdolls thrown by the wayside that they are. But it is a rather fun setup, and that's what matters most. At the bottom right here, you'll notice the Liberation Mode meter. This is charged over time and by attacking enemies. When it's full, hitting circle and triangle at the same time will put you into Liberation Mode. This is Aya's most powerful ability, aside from time travel. Your movement becomes short-range teleportation, your pistols have infinite ammo and increased damage, and your opportunities to dive into enemies becomes much more frequent. But the mode does not last for long, and it takes a long time to charge it up. All of this makes for a rather compelling, albeit cumbersome battle system for the PSP. But camera aside, there are issues with its ability to remain fun, and this largely comes from the length and scale of the battles as well as the enemy types. Unfortunately, the majority of the enemies, while interesting concepts, are not that fun to fight, and the length you must fight them for can be absolutely infuriating. You can't just choose to run away either, as most progression in the game is moving from one locked room to the next. Once you enter a room, you cannot leave until you kill all the enemies and enemy generators. Although this game only has about 7 hours of main story content, your playtime will stretch to roughly the 10-hour mark, having to replay areas following multiple game overs. If it seems Third Birthday dropped all the RPG mechanics from earlier entries, this isn't quite the case. Aya can level up with XP, but it hardly feels like it has much effect. One of the coolest things you get to build Aya stronger is called the DNA board. This DNA board is a 3x3 grid, which you can equip different kinds of orbs and different patterns to. If you place your orbs correctly, you can maximize the space you have by causing overlapped abilities to combine or level up. If you don't use your space well, you will have a bunch of weak abilities, or even negative effects on your character. While it's not very deep, it's a great idea, easy to understand, and very useful. And the last thing I want to talk about here, you probably already noticed, and that's the fan service. As Aya takes damage, this damage is reflected in her attire. As you guys know, I have no problem with fan service, but its inclusion in this game feels very out of place and definitely left a bad taste in most people's mouths shortly after release. Strangely enough, this idea was first introduced by character designer Tetsuya Nomura. Along with 15 other ideas, they sent this idea to everybody in the office to vote on. The top 5 ideas would make it into the game, and everybody thought this idea was one of the top 5. There's never a real reason for this in the game, it's simply here because it could be done. Does she look good? For a PSP game, of course she does, but given the overwhelmingly serious tone of the game, it comes off as just out of place. She's not the only one that underwent a character change either. Maida from Parasite Eve I makes a return, only now he's some lowly Japanese pervert with a strange idolization complex for Aya. And his voice acting, my god.
You said the Babel is an overdrive system. Are you positive?
I compared the remains of the previous device with the Babel's structure. Although they differ in parts, the basics are the same. The one responsible for creating the CTI device is.
It's not that he can't act proper tones, but I find myself wondering if the voice actor ever read a written piece of text in his life. While the majority of the voice actors are okay, some are just barely any better. Like your one friend who still has a really young voice trying his best at a Christian Bale Batman impersonation.
We'll go elsewhere. Besides, she doesn't need to hear what we have to say.
Visually, I would say this game has the best graphics of the trilogy, but possibly the worst art design and setting. The cinematics are rad as hell and really highlight one of Square's strongest points as a development studio. The sound effects are mostly good. The game runs well, and the soundtrack, as unpopular as this might be to say, I thought was pretty great. It's not as good as Parasite Eve I's, but some of the songs it takes from that game I actually thought were improved upon in this one. Listen to these 2 clips here, the first being from Parasite Eve I, and the second being the reorchestration on Third Birthday. Personally, I prefer the latter. Now that covers just about everything, but a while back I asked a 2-pronged question. When this game went into development, its intent was to introduce Aya Brea to a new generation of gamers and use a new generation style of gameplay. Did they succeed? Well, despite a few hang-ups, I think they succeeded at half of it. I think they made an interesting yet convoluted story with some fun gameplay mechanics, limited only by the system the game was developed for, and a few enemies that simply weren't fun to fight. What they failed at resoundingly was introducing Aya to a new audience of gamers and carrying on her legacy as they intended. And I don't say this because of her amnesia-triggered personality change. No, it's a bit more insulting than that. And to explain it, I'm going to have to spoil the whole story. If you guys don't want it spoiled for you, click this time down here. You got about 5 seconds. Alright, time's up. Let's get into it. So, in 2010, in this story, Aya is at a church getting married to her lover. In the audience is the young Eve. During the wedding, a SWAT team arrives and opens fire. Aya is shot and on the verge of death. To save Aya's life, Eve dives into her body. This causes Aya's spirit to split into pieces and spread throughout the world to later manifest themselves as the Twisted. So in part, the entire story happens because Eve tried to save Aya's life. The Babel, the Twisted, the time travel, everything. The story actually gets more convoluted than this, but that's what you need to know. Following the attack at the church, Aya has a new personality and the ability to time travel, because Aya is actually Eve in Aya's body. The true Aya doesn't get any screen time until roughly the last 6 minutes of the game. The Aya we all know and love is still in the game, and she's still as strong and badass as we remember, but again, she's only in it for the last 6 minutes. The rest of the game you actually play as Eve. If this is how you introduce an established character to a new audience, this couldn't have been done more wrong. But good on the writers, they managed to find a way to change her entire character and assuage criticism that the established character was de-written. That said, I'm still going to launch the criticism at them anyway. This honestly just feels like an overly convoluted way to use an established character and body to sell a game with a different personality. They wanted to make a character that resembled the wave of moe anime girls that were taking over the world at the time, and they knew they would be raked over the coals if they seemingly changed her for no reason, so this is what they came up with. A Parasite Eve game where Aya gets less screen time than anybody else. Who could have saw that coming? On its own, I think the game is fun enough, and my biggest complaints are merely through feeling like I've been cheated as a fan. But that feeling isn't a legitimate criticism of the work, as it's not based on the merits of the game itself. I think this game is best enjoyed the same way I feel Parasite Eve II is, as its own entirely separate thing. In fact, looking back at the whole trilogy, I feel that way about each game in the series. As a series, its identity seems to be not having an identity at all. Each piece is best experienced by considering it separate from the rest. I wouldn't avoid recommending any of these games, but I likely wouldn't recommend all of them to the same person. Based on your taste, some entries will work and some simply will not. And thus concludes the Parasite Eve trilogy of reviews. If you guys found this video useful or entertaining at all, like, comment, subscribe. Links to socials are in the description, share the video if you can, and as always folks, thanks for watching.